November 1923. A loaf of bread in Berlin costs 200 billion marks. Not 200. Not 200 million. 200 billion. A few months earlier, that same loaf cost 160 marks. A year before that, less than 1 mark. This is hyperinflation. And it doesn't just destroy money. It destroys societies. In Weimar Germany, workers were paid twice a day because prices rose so fast that morning wages were worthless by afternoon. People carried money in wheelbarrows, not because they were rich but because you needed a wheelbarrow of cash to buy groceries. Thieves would steal the wheelbarrow and leave the money because the wheelbarrow was worth more. The German mark, which in 1914 had been one of the world's most stable currencies, became worthless paper. At the peak of the crisis, the exchange rate was 4.2 trillion marks to $1. The printing presses literally couldn't keep up with the pace of inflation. The government was printing million-mark notes that became worthless before the ink dried. But here's what makes Weimar hyperinflation so important. This wasn't just an economic disaster. It was a social and political catastrophe that helped create the conditions for Hitler's rise to power. When you destroy a currency, you destroy the middle class. When you destroy the middle class, you create desperation. And desperate people turn to extremists who promise simple solutions. The story of Weimar hyperinflation is usually told as a cautionary tale about printing too much money. And that's part of it. But the real story is more complex and more relevant. It's about how the winners of a war punished the losers so severely that they destroyed the global economy. It's about how political paralysis and weak institutions turn economic problems into catastrophes. It's about how inflation doesn't just rob people of wealth but of hope and stability. And here's what should terrify you. The mechanisms that created Weimar hyperinflation still exist. Massive government debts. Political pressure to print money. International payment systems that can break down. The specific circumstances were unique to post-World War I Germany. But the underlying dynamics could happen anywhere that governments lose control of their currencies and their credibility. Rudolf Havenstein was president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, during the hyperinflation. He's the man who kept the printing presses running. Havenstein genuinely believed he was helping by printing more money. When prices rose, businesses needed more currency to pay workers and buy supplies. Havenstein thought he was accommodating legitimate demand. He didn't understand, or refused to admit, that the printing itself was causing the inflation. He died in November 1923, right at the peak of the crisis, still insisting he'd done the right thing. Hjalmar Schacht replaced Havenstein and ended the hyperinflation in a matter of weeks. Schacht understood what Havenstein didn't. Credibility matters more than money supply. He introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed theoretically by real estate and industrial assets. The backing was partly fiction, but people believed in it. Schacht also did something radical. He refused to print more money even when the government demanded it. The hyperinflation stopped almost immediately. Schacht proved that hyperinflation is ultimately about trust and credibility, not just money printing. Gustav Stresemann was the German chancellor for a few critical months in 1923. He made the hard decisions that stopped the hyperinflation, accepting reality about reparations, ending passive resistance in the Ruhr, and stabilizing the currency. These decisions were politically toxic. Stresemann's government fell after just a few months. But his policies worked. Unfortunately, by then the damage was done. The Weimar workers and middle class were the primary victims. Workers saw their wages become worthless between payday and grocery shopping. Pensioners watched retirement savings evaporate. The middle class, which had patriotically bought war bonds, was wiped out when those bonds became worthless. An entire generation learned that saving was stupid and the government couldn't be trusted. This created the psychological conditions for extremism. Hugo Stinnes was an industrialist who became one of the richest men in Germany during hyperinflation. He understood the game: borrow heavily, buy real assets, repay the loans with worthless money. Stinnes built an empire during the crisis by exploiting inflation. He borrowed millions of marks, bought factories and mines, then repaid the loans with money that was worth almost nothing. It was wealth transfer on a massive scale, from savers to debtors, from wage earners to asset owners. The Allied leaders, particularly French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré, made the crisis worse by demanding reparations Germany couldn't pay. When Germany defaulted, France occupied the industrial Ruhr region to extract reparations by force. This destroyed what was left of the German economy and made hyperinflation inevitable. The Allies won the war but lost the peace by creating conditions that would eventually lead to World War II. To understand Weimar hyperinflation, you have to start with World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. Germany lost the war. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 imposed massive reparations. Germany was required to pay 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical sum, about $33 billion at the time. For context, Germany's entire annual GDP was around 40 billion marks. The reparations were designed to punish Germany and ensure they could never threaten France again. But they also made economic recovery nearly impossible. Germany had to transfer enormous wealth abroad every year. This required running trade surpluses, earning foreign currency to make payments. But Germany's industrial capacity had been damaged by the war, and the Allies were simultaneously restricting German exports to protect their own industries. It was an impossible situation. Germany couldn't pay the reparations without destroying its economy. But if they didn't pay, the Allies would occupy German territory and take what they wanted by force. Germany's options were all bad. They could raise taxes massively to pay reparations, but this would crush the economy and probably trigger revolution. They could cut government spending severely, but unemployment was already high and cutting spending would make it worse. Or they could print money to cover the difference between what they took in and what they needed to pay. They chose option 3. The Reichsbank started printing marks to cover government deficits and make reparation payments. Initially, this seemed to work. The economy didn't collapse. Unemployment stayed manageable. But inflation started creeping up. The German government had another problem. They'd financed World War I largely through borrowing, not taxation. They'd issued war bonds assuming they'd win and extract reparations from defeated enemies. Instead, they lost, and now those debts had to be repaid while also paying reparations to the Allies. The political system was also weak. The Weimar Republic was Germany's first democracy, established after the Kaiser abdicated in 1918. But it lacked legitimacy with much of the population. Right-wing groups blamed the Republic for losing the war and accepting the Versailles Treaty. Left-wing groups wanted communist revolution. The moderate center was politically weak. This meant the government couldn't make hard choices. Raising taxes was political suicide. Cutting spending would trigger unrest. The path of least resistance was printing money and hoping something changed. By 1921, inflation was accelerating. The mark, which had been about 4 to the dollar before the war, was now trading at 60 to the dollar. Prices were rising noticeably. But this wasn't hyperinflation yet. It was just serious inflation. The crisis point came in January 1923. Germany defaulted on reparation payments, claiming inability to pay. France and Belgium responded by occupying the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. German workers engaged in passive resistance, refusing to work for the occupiers. The German government supported this resistance by continuing to pay the striking workers. This destroyed the government's finances. Tax revenue from the Ruhr disappeared because production stopped. But spending continued and actually increased to pay striking workers. The only way to cover the gap was printing money. Lots of money. In January 1923, when France occupied the Ruhr, the exchange rate was about 18,000 marks to the dollar. Bad, but not catastrophic yet. You could still function with marks. Prices were rising, but slowly enough that you could plan. By summer 1923, things were spiraling out of control. The exchange rate hit 1 million marks to the dollar in August. Prices were doubling every few days. Workers demanded daily wages instead of weekly. Some factories paid workers 3 times a day so they could buy food before the money lost value. The social impact was devastating. Anyone with savings in bank accounts or bonds was being wiped out. The middle class, which had saved responsibly and bought government bonds to support the war effort, watched their wealth evaporate. A lifetime of savings couldn't buy a week's groceries. But people with debts, especially mortgages, made out like bandits. If you'd borrowed money to buy a house, you could now repay the entire mortgage with what used to be a week's wages. This created perverse incentives. Borrowing was rewarded. Saving was punished. The lesson was clear. Prudence and thrift were for suckers. Farmers and people with access to real goods had power. If you had food or products to sell, you could demand payment in foreign currency or goods. Money was worthless, but potatoes, bread, and coal had value. Barter became common. Workers would take part of their wages in goods from the factory because cash was useless. The famous images of Weimar hyperinflation come from this period. Children playing with stacks of worthless bills like building blocks. People burning money for heat because it was cheaper than buying firewood. The wallpaper made from mark notes because paper was more valuable than the currency printed on it. By November 1923, the situation was beyond absurd. The Reichsbank was printing marks in denominations that seemed impossible. 1 trillion mark notes. The printing presses ran 24 hours a day and still couldn't keep up. The government was considering issuing notes with even more zeros, but they literally ran out of zeros. The exchange rate hit 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. At this point, prices weren't just rising daily. They were rising hourly. A cup of coffee would cost one price when you ordered it and a higher price when you finished drinking it. Restaurants stopped printing prices on menus because they changed too fast. People developed coping mechanisms. Workers would rush from the payroll office to stores to buy anything of value before the money depreciated further. Housewives would go shopping multiple times a day as more money came in. Foreign currency, especially US dollars, became the real currency. People who could earn dollars or had goods to barter were fine. Everyone else was suffering. The social fabric was tearing. Elderly people on fixed pensions were starving. People who'd worked their whole lives and saved had nothing. Crime spiked as desperate people stole food. Political extremism grew. Both the communists and the Nazis gained support. People were looking for someone to blame and someone who promised to fix it. In November 1923, three things happened almost simultaneously. Rudolf Havenstein died, still insisting the money printing was necessary. Hjalmar Schacht took over the Reichsbank. And Gustav Stresemann's government introduced the Rentenmark. The Rentenmark was supposedly backed by mortgages on German real estate and bonds on German industry. In reality, this backing was largely fictional. There was no way to actually redeem Rentenmarks for land or factories. But people believed in it because they wanted to believe. More importantly, Schacht made clear the government would stop printing money. There would be a fixed supply of Rentenmarks. The effect was almost magical. In a matter of weeks, inflation stopped. Prices stabilized. The economy began functioning again. The Rentenmark held its value even though it wasn't really backed by anything. This proved the critical point. Hyperinflation is fundamentally about confidence and credibility, not money supply. But the damage was done. An entire generation had been traumatized. The middle class was destroyed. Savings were gone. Faith in government and institutions was shattered. The Weimar Republic survived the hyperinflation but never recovered its legitimacy. 10 years later, the Nazis would exploit the resentment and desperation created by the hyperinflation to take power. If you think Weimar hyperinflation is ancient history with no modern relevance, you're dangerously wrong. We've seen multiple hyperinflations since then, each following a similar pattern. Zimbabwe in the 2000s printed money until inflation hit billions of percent. At the peak, prices were doubling every day. The government printed $100 trillion notes. Eventually, Zimbabwe abandoned its own currency and started using US dollars and South African rand. The mechanism was identical to Weimar. Government deficits financed by printing money, credibility collapse, hyperinflation. Venezuela is experiencing hyperinflation right now. The bolivar has lost essentially all its value. People use US dollars for transactions. Venezuelans have wheelbarrows full of bolivars just like Weimar Germans had wheelbarrows of marks. The government keeps printing money to pay its bills, prices keep rising, and the currency keeps collapsing. Argentina has had multiple bouts of high inflation and several hyperinflations. The pattern is always the same. Government can't or won't collect enough taxes to cover spending, central bank prints money to finance deficits, inflation spirals out of control. Argentina is so used to this pattern that people automatically convert to dollars whenever they save. Lebanon's currency collapsed in recent years. Turkey is experiencing high inflation as the lira weakens. Sri Lanka faced a currency crisis. These aren't full hyperinflations like Weimar, but they're following the same script. Weak government finances, printing money, loss of confidence, currency collapse. The common thread is always the same. Governments face difficult choices. Raising taxes is politically costly. Cutting spending hurts constituents. Printing money seems like the easy solution. But printing money only works until people lose confidence in the currency. Once confidence breaks, hyperinflation can happen very quickly. Developed countries aren't immune. After the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID pandemic, central banks printed trillions. The US, Europe, and Japan all ran massive quantitative easing programs. So far, this hasn't caused hyperinflation, but it's created enormous government debts and expanded money supplies. The reason developed countries have avoided hyperinflation is credibility. People believe the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan won't let inflation spiral out of control. That credibility is valuable. But it's not infinite. If governments keep running unsustainable deficits and central banks keep printing money to finance them, confidence could eventually break. Weimar hyperinflation teaches three fundamental lessons. First, hyperinflation is ultimately about credibility, not just money supply. Rudolf Havenstein printed trillions of marks and inflation exploded. Hjalmar Schacht stopped printing and inflation ended, even though he introduced a currency backed by nothing real. The difference was credibility. People believed Schacht wouldn't print more money, so they accepted the Rentenmark. They didn't believe Havenstein, so they fled the mark. Second, inflation is a hidden tax that falls hardest on the poor and middle class. The wealthy had assets that held value. They had access to foreign currency. Many even profited from inflation by borrowing and buying real assets. But workers, pensioners, and savers were destroyed. Hyperinflation is one of the most regressive forms of taxation possible. It wipes out the savings of people who did everything right. Third, economic catastrophe creates political extremism. The Weimar hyperinflation didn't directly cause Hitler, but it created the conditions that made Nazism possible. It destroyed the middle class, created mass resentment, and shattered faith in democratic institutions. When people are desperate and angry, they turn to demagogues who promise simple solutions and offer scapegoats to blame. Here's what should worry you. Many countries today have the same conditions that led to Weimar hyperinflation. Massive government debts that can't be repaid through taxation. Political systems too weak or divided to make hard choices. Central banks under pressure to print money to cover deficits. And populations that don't understand the danger until it's too late. Developed countries have more credibility and stronger institutions than Weimar Germany. But credibility can be lost. If governments keep running huge deficits, if central banks keep printing money, if political paralysis prevents necessary reforms, confidence could eventually break. And once it breaks, hyperinflation can happen faster than anyone expects. The Weimar hyperinflation happened because of a specific set of circumstances. Lost war, unpayable reparations, weak government, occupation of industrial regions. Those specific circumstances won't repeat. But the underlying dynamic, governments printing money to cover deficits they can't finance otherwise, that happens all the time. And every time it does, there's a risk it spirals into hyperinflation. If this video made you think differently about inflation and the value of credible institutions, share it. Because understanding how hyperinflation happens is essential to preventing it. Subscribe for more explorations of economic disasters and what they teach us about maintaining monetary stability. Weimar Germany showed that destroying a currency destroys a society. We should remember that lesson before we find ourselves carrying wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread.